All right, so I'm going to try to do at least the second, excuse me, at least the first half of the chapter 4 recording tonight as well. So just a couple things to pay attention to. This chapter we're going to hear some more rumors surrounding Gatsby, rumors and background story. There's going to be some things that are going to be a little fishy, so notice how Gatsby reacts when he meets Nick. We're also going to hear about how Daisy knows Gatsby, so we're going to kind of go back in the past. We're going to hear about their connection, and this whole time Nick gets invited to spend some time with Gatsby. It's a little shady, so we're going to meet this man named Mr. Wolfsheim. We don't know anything official, but this meeting kind of feels a little less than credible. So thinking about what you know from the 1920s and kind of the connections that people have together, I'm not saying that Gatsby's a bootlegger, but just being aware that this is a time when society has that corruption, people have those connections, money talks, and so we're just meant to get this sense that Gatsby may not be the man that he seems, right? So the other big thing is pay attention to the background about Daisy and Tom's marriage. We're also going to get their story. And so we're going to see specifically Gatsby using Nick for some reason. So this chapter is all about kind of giving people's backgrounds and starting to make the connections between the characters. At this point, you've met all the key characters. So the people we need to care about are Tom and Daisy, Gatsby and Nick, Jordan, Myrtle. Everyone else is kind of like an auxiliary character, meaning they're on the fringes, but those are our key cast of characters. They're the major shakers and movers, and their stories are all going to be intertwined, which is kind of cool. So we're going to start with chapter 4 on page 61. Let me take some water first. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house, and twinkling hilarity on his yard. Oh, this isn't my copy of the book. He's a bootlegger, said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass. Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It was an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed, "This schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality, and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him." Okay, as a side note, Nick is going to go on this long rant about different people. I'm going to read them all, but just know that the reason he's doing this is just to kind of establish who's who and what's what. So remember, we have East Egg Society, West Egg Society. That's all this is doing. From East Egg, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches. Oh, and this is just Fitzgerald, our author, trying to show you how ridiculous this, like, upper-class society, the idea that, like, certain people are more important than other people. Yeah, this is him showing us that that's just ridiculous through Nick's narration. Okay, bottom of page 61. From East Egg, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, who I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Cavett, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and the whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather Hubert Ockerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence Endive was from East Egg, as I remember. He came only once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Eddie in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the O.R.P. Shrouders, and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, and the Fish Guards of the Ripley Snells. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitbait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink and the Hammerheads, and Beluga the tobacco importer and the Beluga girls. Not done. From West Egg came the Poles and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Showen, and the Gulick the state senator, and Newton Orchid, who controlled films par excellence, and Eckhost and Clyde Cohen and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Catlips and the Bembergs and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. DeFonto the promoter came there, and Ed Largos, and James B. Rotgut Ferret, and the DeJongs and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and Associated Attraction would have to fluctuate profitably next day. A man named Klipsbrigger was there so often and so long that he became known as the Boarder. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people, there was Gus Wise and Horace O'Donovan and Lester Meyer and George Duckweed and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Cromes and the Backhoysons and the Denekers and Russell Betty and the Corrigans and the Kellehers and the Dewars and the Scullys and S.W. Blecker and the Smirks and the young Quinns, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenahan arrived with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical one with another that it inevitably seemed they had been there before. I've forgotten their names. Jacqueline, I think, or else Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months, or the sterner ones of great American capitalists whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all those I can remember, that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Bedecker girls, and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Oxbrockberger and Miss Hagg, his fiancée, and Ardita Fitzpeters, and Mr. P. Jewett, who had once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hip, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something, whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I had ever known it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. Okay, that's just meant to show you, how ridiculous this society is, and this idea that names don't actually matter, even though we like to pretend that we do. Do we still do that today? Maybe we do. Okay, so back to the actual story from Nick's perspective. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American. That comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work, or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner, in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody'd seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hamp boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored the dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month, and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So my first impression, that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished, and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear. So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversations in his halls. I'll tell you God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated in Oxford, because all my ancestors had been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase, educated at Oxford, or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. What part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. My family all died, and I came into a great deal of money. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that I lived like a young Rajah, all over the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. With an effort I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they invoked no image except that of a turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore, as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but it seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. The Argonne Forest and I took machine-gun detachments so far forward that there were half-a-mile gap on either side of us, where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of the dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro, little Montenegro, down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history, and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstance, which elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordere de Danilo, ran the circular legend. Montenegro Nicholas Rex. Turnip. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in an archway, through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much, younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson-lighted depths, the gnawing of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever stepped foot on his old, overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria. Only half. For as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar chug-chug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. "All right, old sport," called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. "Right you are," agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. "Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me." What was that? The picture of Oxford? "I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year." Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders, making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty of the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen, without any particular wonder. Okay, notice a break. We're shifting in time. Roaring noon. In a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. Oh, hold on, I'm just going to check how many more pages we have for this chapter. Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfshame." A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with an expressive nose. "I handed him the money to Catchbook, and I said, 'All right, Catchbook, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth.' He shut it then and there." Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. "Highballs?" asked the waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs in the ceiling, "but I like across the street better." "Yes, highballs," agreed Gatsby, and then to Mr. Wolfsheim, "It's too hot over there." "Hot and small, yes," said Mr. Wolfsheim, "but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old metropole." "The old metropole," brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily, "filled with faces dead and gone, filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rothstell there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drank all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says somebody wants to speak to him outside. 'All right,' says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled down his chair. 'Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you, so help me, move outside this room.' It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd have raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight." Did he go? I asked innocently. Sure he went. Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed me indignantly. He turned around the door and says, "Don't let that waiter take away my coffee." Then he went out on the sidewalk, and they shot him 3 times in the full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becker. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. I understand you're looking for a business connection. The juxtaposition of the 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. Oh no, he exclaimed. This isn't the man. No? Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I had a wrong man. A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered, and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing to underhand, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't all right. Suddenly, he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at, and a perfect gentleman. Yes, he's an Oxford man. Oh. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College? I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby for a long time? I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding when I talked to him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, he flipped his sleeve up under the coat. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. I have enjoyed my lunch, he said, and I'm going to run off from you 2 young men before I outstay my welcome. Don't hurry, Mayor, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hand in a sort of benediction. You're very polite, but I belong to another generation, he announced solemnly. You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your... He supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. As for me, I'm 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer. As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wonder if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, explained Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a Denzian of Broadway. Who is he, anyhow, an actor? No. A dentist? Meyer Wolfsheim? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly, He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Fixed the World Series, I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people, with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. How did he happen to do that? I asked after a minute. He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. Come along with me for a minute, I said. I've got to say hello to someone. When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. Daisy's furious because you haven't called up. All right, so that's a good spot to start there for two reasons. Number one, because we're shifting away from Mr. Wolfsheim and kind of Gatsby's mysterious past, his mysterious connections, and now we're meeting Tom and starting to see how Gatsby behaves when Tom is around before we go into Tom and Daisy and Gatsby's past. So we're on the bottom. We just finished page 73. My voice is really tired, so that's all the reading that I can do for tonight. That was a full hour if you watched the other half of chapter 3. So hopefully I'll finish the other half tomorrow night, or maybe even a little bit later. It looks like I only have about 6 pages, so I might try to do that in a half hour or so. All right, bye guys.